Hey, welcome to Open Door with Dr. Brett. And I'm Dr. Brett. And I'm here today with my buddy Tristan. How are you, pal?
Hey, I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. So we're on opposite sides of the country. What's the weather like on the East Coast?
Uh, well, it's gorgeous. Yesterday was stormy, but I haven't been outside yet today. I can just look at it outside of the windows, but it looks gorgeous and seems like there's a nice breeze. It's beautiful here,
Awesome.
actually.
I should say
So I'm lucky.
I should say my eccentric buddy Tristan, right? Because you're a bit of a vampire. Hey, so today I wanted to talk to
True.
you. Today I wanted to talk to you about a topic that's fascinating that literally we could probably spend 2 or 3 days on: character and personality. Because
Mm,
both of us deal, I deal with so many human beings as a life coach, psychologist, sports psychologist, and so on. And I know you've dealt with so many human beings in your lifetime. And so we bat back and forth, these discussions around character and personality and how capable people are of change. So just off the top
right.
of your head, before we'll go back and forth on this, but what are your initial thoughts as I introduce the topic, knowing that you haven't, prepared for it? I just go right in with something.
Uh, hmm.
I've got them
That
stumped.
there's yeah. Well, it's exactly like so the first thing that popped into my head when you said that was ocean, right?
Ocean.
Uh yeah, which is openness, conscientiousness,
Conscientiousness.
extroversions, agreeableness, neuroticism, service
Got it. So you're
orientation,
talking
team
about the
orientation.
top five. You're talking about like the big five personality traits, right?
Exactly.
Character and personality can be defined slightly differently, can't they?
Um yes, because well, they're interlinked, we know, but your character is how you truly are, and your personality is how you come across. So,
Interest, very interesting. So
yeah,
you're saying, yeah. So you're saying that the character, there's something deeper in character than one's personality, so to speak.
yes, definitely. So, uh, hmm. So let's take for example someone that is extremely neurotic, right?
Hmm. Yeah. So,
So,
so just for the audience sake, I often define neurotic as anxious, tense, and insecure. It's a definition I looked up decades ago, and
I
it's
like
kind
it.
of, yeah, it stuck with me because I was watching a Woody Allen movie, and they used, he's like the perfect caricature of neurotic, and so I'm sitting there going, okay, like what does exactly neurotic mean? And then I looked it up, and it goes anxious, tense, and insecure. So there we go. So
Right.
neurotic, anxious, tense, and insecure.
Mm. So if you have a neurotic individual, a lot of the times they can mask that in public, and they can mask that at work or in a singular conversation with somebody, but it's not
Mm,
necessarily their character. It's not
hmm.
who they in essence are,
Mm,
but they
interesting.
have learned to work with it and adapt it in environments to make it less noticeable to other.
Okay,
So
so this is fascinating.
personality,
Yeah. So
mm,
let me break
for
this
sure.
apart a little bit as you're talking, Tristan, because it's interesting. You've already used a fascinating aspect of this that I wanted to get to at some point. The idea that character can transcend environment, right? But there's also this
Yes,
idea in psychology that environments matter, something I say a lot, and it actually can shape how we show up in certain situations. But the idea of character
absolutely.
that you're alluding to is actually deeper. So there's something underneath, right? Like the word, some people are more courageous, right? Some people are more adventurous. Some people are more assertive. Some people are tougher, right? These are
Mm,
aspects of character that to a certain extent can transcend environment. But also what you're implying here, right, is that that's not always the case.
Yes, yes, and the the tricky part is, does enough of the masking in an environment actually change your character? Or is it that your character stays the same? Does it depend on age? If you're a teenager doing it or if you're an adult doing it? So I've seen that in older adults, I can't even say older, after 27, 28, I find that most people tend to change very little when it comes to core values and their character.
Interesting.
But prior to that, I find that it's more in flux. It's in a changing moment. You know, they had just been thrown into the deep end, into university life or into work life. So they're
Mm.
still trying to figure it out. So they're willing to change. But after that, they've got kind of stuck in their ways because it's either working or not. And they're stuck if it's working, and they're stuck if it's not working.
Yeah, so that's
So,
sort of, look, I mean, look, I'm in the business of change, right? And,
right,
as you know, I'm guiding a lot of adolescents, a lot of athletes, but a lot of, 15 to 25-year-olds, so to speak. And one of the
right.
passions and joys that I have is that, there's so much influence that you can have in mentoring and guiding kids that are sort of still developing their personality and their character, so to speak. And what you're
Yeah, I
saying
love
is
it.
that by 28 or 30, it's pretty fixed. In psychology,
Yes,
people often say it's fixed sooner than that, right? By age 10 or 11 or
now,
12, right? The
which I don't
fundamentals of your
really.
character are shaped. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, that's actually fascinating. You bring that up. So I think it's semantics that
Hmm.
gets fixated, or it that gets there's confusion brought up. So, um, in my opinion, I think that when they're writing these white papers on your character being fixed, or from the age of 5 until 9 years of age, for example, because of how family life and experiences, etc., that it morphs and builds into everything you build on top. So it's kind of like the foundational blocks, the building blocks are set at that age.
Hmm.
Now, okay, yes, there is truth in that. But if you think about it, what shape does a home take when you've just put the foundation in? I mean,
Hmm.
looking at just the foundation, the cement foundation, can you really see if it's going to be a Mediterranean home or a colonial style home or a Victorian home? You have absolutely no concept of what shape it's going to take. Yes, it has a, a, a singular foundation. That foundation is not going to change thereafter,
Hmm.
but there's so many different avenues and sprouts that can be sprung off from that you can almost barely unbox a Victorian and understand its foundation at the end of it, because it's taken on so many different variations and forms thereafter. So being able to you know talk about those blocks as being the whole encompassing character of an individual, I think is wrong, and I think it's a confused way of looking at it. So
Hmm.
I would say that more the facade, so including the foundation, the build out of the home, and its presence to the rest of the world, I think is more known and almost complete by the time they're 28 or 29. And I think that's more of something that is more meaningful.
Hmm.
Yes, you can take foundational blocks, but rewiring foundational blocks, okay, that is for that's serious, because imagine trying to rebuild another home because you're changing the foundation. I mean, oh my God, it could be a 20-year process. That's
Yeah.
that's
So,
serious.
like,
And most of the
so
changes you're trying to create, Brett, are they 20-year endeavors?
yeah, so look, I mean, so this is really interesting, right? This kind of somewhat debate about whether something is like character is fixed in stone by a certain age, sometimes people would say it's younger than age 28. I'm obviously a believer because I've done so much psychology and coaching, and I tend to
Exactly.
be super positive, right? I believe that people can change, right? That they can change
Yeah, but
aspects of their
foundational, like
character.
the foundation blocks.
R- Right, but the foundational piece is largely in place. A lot of times I see it largely in place by adolescence, right?
Mm,
Especially by late adolescence. Like things like
mm-hmm.
bravery and courage and strength and autonomy and kindness. These are aspects of character, right?
Mm,
Those dynamics are often largely in place. Now, I'm not saying you can't change them, Tristan, right? I truly
right.
believe you can change them, but as we both know, the only way you really find out who you really are or who your partner really is, the shape of your partner's character, is to put people under stress. It's under stress and
Yes.
duress that we really find out what character's about. So, for example,
And where you can really create change, right?
and where you can really create change. So, for example, a woman sent me a text that I've been working with for a while. She's 33 years old. She just had her 30-year-old boyfriend move in with her, and it's not going well, and he's doing a lot of blame. Now, what she's finding out in living with him is that he has all kinds of issues around intimacy. Now, I've been coaching her on and off for years, so she's aware of what she brings to the table. She's aware she's not perfect. She's aware she has tendencies to get codependent at time, be a little bit
Right.
needy. But this guy
Right.
is freaked out and blaming and what I call replaying aspects of his childhood in this dynamic with her since they've moved in together because he's not very conscious. He's not getting coaching or guidance. And really, he's just recreating his early childhood environment, and so it's not going well. But part of the reason it's not going well is she's moved someone in her house who she didn't really know all these different personality characteristics until they start to live together, right?
Right.
You've had a ton of experience. I know you have. You've traveled the
Yeah.
world. You've had a lot of relationships. You've had all kinds of experiences. You and I, we bat this back and forth, right? We don't know who someone
Yes.
really is in our lives, again, until you work with them every day, until you live with them, or you go through some kind of extreme situation with them, right?
Yes. And I think that comes into the keyword personas. And so many people have many or multiple personas. One's for work, one's for social, one's for their childhood friends, one's for their family. And they're all
Yeah, so the
different. And
persona
that
is
word
how the
is part of,
personality, yeah. So the persona, right, Tristan, is how the personality appears in public, right? Is that how you would
it's,
define
yeah,
persona?
it's relatable to personality. So it actually is personality. It's what is being perceived, or what you're presenting to that party of people. And that's the difference, in my opinion, to character. Character is you, you know,
Hmm.
deeply you, not what you're presenting, not your
Right.
persona, not that personality. So
Hmm.
that, I think, is where it gets tricky. And this woman that you're referencing, she got a persona of this gentleman, and she didn't see all the other personas that he has, which would have given her a deeper understanding of his true character.
Well, she
And
never saw exactly. Well, she never got a real sense of his true character until he actually moved in with her. And then the
exactly,
stress and pressure of the intimacy, right, put
exactly,
him under
because
pressure. And then under
mm,
pressure, he's turning out to be angry, critical,
yes,
judgmental, a blamer. In other words,
geez,
look, look, what I've said to her from the beginning is he just sounds young, immature. Because I don't say that I don't necessarily
mm,
believe that at 30 that he's fixed in stone this way if he were to do a significant personal growth journey. Now, most people don't do significant personal growth journeys. So in other
You
words, they
brought
don't
up
look,
a
yeah,
very
go ahead.
interesting point. Extremely interesting. If so, that's actually fascinating. Um, if someone stays a child with very little growth and perspective and mentorship, by the time they're 30 years of age, there's a lot of growth that can happen very quickly with perspective, experience, and mentorship. But
Exactly.
if
Exactly.
somebody had a lot of experience, mentorship, and they're still screwy by the time they're 30 years of
Totally.
age,
That's
that
well
is
said.
very, very difficult.
Okay, so that's really well said. It's an excellent distinction. It's one I actually believe in and agree with as well. Because, like, a lot of times people, talk about, things like premarital counseling, and it's a great concept in general, to get,
Mm,
perspective and guidance before you get married. But when you
right.
have to do it, right, because something is drastically wrong, often that's super problematic. In other
What
words,
do you mean?
in other words, if someone hasn't done personal growth for real, right? And then you find
Hmm.
yourself in a situation where two people are so attached to getting married that they have to do it, they got to do the counseling, right? A lot of
Yes.
times you're bumping up against deeper issues that can be super problematic. So there's one
Yeah.
thing that's preventative, and then there's another concept called relatively ingrained stuff. And in this guy's case, what she's learning is, if look, I said to her, even if he started doing personal growth for real, I'm not talking about a life coach here because his issues sound deeper. He's got what we call in psychology jargon, like engulfment fears, fears of being smothered. Whereas a lot of people, what I was explaining to her this morning is a
Interesting.
lot of people have either abandonment fear or engulfment fear. It's not uncommon to have one or the other or both. And in her case, she's
You
got
know,
abandonment
when
fear.
when
And in
you
his
said
case, he's
engulfed,
got,
I was
yeah.
thinking like it's a, uh, engulfed was like you're engulfed in what you've taken in from 4 to 8
Immersed.
years, like 5 to 9 years of age. Like you're ingrained in it, it's stuck in you, you're engulfed in that and can never get out of those foundational, traumas or whatever it is. It's kind of interesting.
Well,
I like that word.
some people get like, inappropriately smothered by parents and then they have engulfment fear later in life. And some people
Right.
get abandoned emotionally. The tricky part is around personality and character is that like little events can trigger these kinds of wounds. So you don't have to
Yes.
have like highly, you don't have to have abusive parents to wind up with abandonment issues. Some
Which
kids are
which is
just
why you were exactly
hypersensitive.
accurate which is why you're exactly accurate when you said that it's if they're immature and they
Hmm.
haven't grown,
Hmm.
that you've seen through experience with your clients and so many people that there's a lot of improvement that can happen in a short amount of time with the right mentorship and guidance and
Well said.
insight.
Exactly. And but sometimes people are damaged. And if you walk into a situation where you wind up moving someone in with you or marrying somebody and you've never lived with them before, and then you find
Mm,
out once you're living with this person that they're pretty damaged. When that's
mm,
the case, I often say you're swimming upstream like a salmon, meaning like,
right.
it's going to be a huge slugfest and it's going to be very
Yeah, it's a
difficult.
struggle.
And yeah, it's a struggle. And, one of the things you and I talk about a lot is you get older in life and you don't want to struggle as much. There's
Right.
positive aspects of struggle and there's negative aspects of struggle. Banging
Well,
your head against the
whether
wall.
you're a bad
Right.
character or a good character or you're depressed, you don't want to struggle against the depression either. So
Right.
it could go positive or it can go negative where you are weaker as you get older in general and you're tired, you're less willing, and it doesn't matter if your life is going well or not going well, you still don't want to fight against the trend of yourself.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think there's wisdom, this concept of wisdom as we age, right? We want to ideally learn from our mistakes, right? and we want to, we want to develop some wisdom. And wisdom to me
Well,
is
you
not
can't do that.
repeating the same mistakes, right? If we're
Yeah, but
repeating the
you don't
same
know
mistakes,
that.
we're not. What do you
Yeah, but
mean?
you don't know that. You can't reflect upon oneself to oneself. The only
Well,
way
what
you
I'm
can
right, but I'm
create
not
that
communicating.
reflection is outside perspective and others. So
Right.
it's
Well, what I'm getting
essential
at
for an individual like that to have a mentor, right? To have
totally. Well, this kid,
experiences.
in this case, this kid's not getting the coaching and guidance, and that's what I've said to her. Is that I said to her two things. One is
Yeah,
he
she'll
needs
have to be
he
his
needs a
doctor.
real he would need a real experienced
Uh,
professional, not a so-called life coach, meaning somebody that understands really deeper psychology because he does have some core issues based on his
I have a
behavior
very
that,
interesting question for you.
yeah.
Um, what do you think if he is to go through that process? Don't you think that he would also need space from all things commitment wise in order to reflect and test and see what works and what doesn't, and then come back to it? In other words, that it's not ideal for him to have mentorship while currently living at her home and inside the relationship that is not really understood yet, that he needs space
Well,
while going through the mentorship in order to then come back to it the way
yeah.
he
So
ought
the
to.
ideal, yeah. So the ideal scenario is the one that you just referred to, is the one where they separate. He does a personal growth journey, and maybe they, get back together, or maybe they don't.
Right.
That's the ideal scenario. In the real world, it often doesn't work
It
that way,
right.
right?
It
Because
never
people have,
happens. Right.
like, well, it does happen occasionally, but people have to have economic means, and they have to have like some wisdom,
Exactly.
some awareness, right? But yes, you're bringing up a larger perspective here, a point around, what's the ideal scenario under which to do personal growth? And the answer is often complex, meaning like sometimes you learn a lot in like throwing yourself in the fire, by living with somebody and struggling with the intimacy. Now you're getting personal growth, so you have a lot of issues to deal with, and therefore it
Mm,
brings up more stuff with the therapist, so to speak. But
right.
sometimes it's too triggering and too traumatizing, and it's just too much. And so
Right.
sometimes you actually need the space. In her situation, it's actually too abusive, meaning he's loving one day and the next day he completely ignores her. And it just
It,
it's too harsh in her situation. What I've invited her to do is to like let him move out because it's not healthy for her, because we've been working successfully on her issues, and now she's up against it with a guy who's not doing personal growth work yet. And what my argument was, Tristan, is even if he started, this is not 3 sessions with a life coach. This is 6 to 18 months of really looking deeper under the hood at your own personal, the ways in which you were raised and how that affects your behavior, so to speak. These are deeper intimacy issues. His like,
well, what's
his
well,
struggle
what's
to sort of,
interesting is
yeah.
you know Nikola Tesla, and one of his quotes is, uh,
We're going with
I do not think you
Tesla
I
and
do not think
intimacy.
you yeah, I do not think you can name many great inventions that have been made by married men. And there's something very interesting about that. He he had spoken about this a lot, that inventors and real creators or self journeymen must have time alone, must have space, and must have silence in order for them to actually get deep into their issues and not have any outside influences, and be able to not be biased to their own opinions of themselves because of others' judgments. So they're in their own, safety space, and this way they can toy with ideas and play with ideas without judgments from others, which allows them a much deeper, more well-rounded way of growing and creating. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think it's fascinating because you're bringing it up in relationship to this intimacy story that we're talking about, the struggle to do personal growth in a relationship versus alone. A lot
Right.
of times, if you have the courage to be alone, sometimes that can be, an absolute home run because you learn how to get in your own skin and get comfortable in your own skin. The metaphor around an inventor is you're not going to be discouraged or overly influenced by other people's ideas or
Well,
other
he could get
people's
discouraged
right.
or influenced by his wife if he's doing personal growth while in the relationship and being at the home all the time, because
Yeah,
he's going to
so
know her judgments constantly.
yeah, so that's the tricky part. That's also part of the reason I have so much passion for these kids that are younger because a lot of times they're not fully developed or formed and they're not married yet, so they're not in these situations where they have no choice, right? They get to grow as a
Right. They're not
person
married to a
first.
university. They're not married to a wife. They're not married, or they're not married to a job. They're not married to a country. They're,
Here's the paradox, Tristan, is that often they are married, and I'm helping them divorce, so to speak, in the sense
yes,
that
yes,
in
yes.
right because a lot of times they come in with like they've only lived in the Northeast.
Fixed
You know what I
notions.
mean? Well, exactly. No, you're right on it. I mean, a lot of times they've only lived in the Northeast or they've never
Right.
traveled outside the US. Like one of the kids I worked with the last week, he went to Cuba and it was very 15-year-old kid went to Cuba. It was very
That's awesome.
eye-opening. Yeah, really
Very awesome.
eye-opening, right? Because it gives him perspective.
Very much so.
Another kid just came back from Europe, one of the athletes I'm working with, and again, he got perspective. So my bias, my perspective is, to get people out of their little comfort zones because as you know, Connecticut or, Massachusetts or Georgia, they're still little relatively microcosms compared to the whole world, right?
Yes. Yes, very much so. Because a lot of these, I mean, these places have identifiable features, right?
Mhm.
If it's a
They
beach
have
society, they have
character or
their,
personality, right?
yes, and it's ingrained since, the colonialists, right?
Mhm.
So each one has defined its identity, and because of that, it 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 I can't say it whitewashes all other perspectives and influences, but it's certainly, if you look at town hall, for example, zoning rights and what you're allowed to do, you'll see that how far can you build a house from the road, or how high can your fence be that you build in front of the home. What kind of facade can you put on the home, or what are the how high can you build a home? How many square feet can you put on, or how many acres can you use for the home itself in comparison to the area of the land? All these things are predefined of the identifiable features of a town. And because of that, it's ingrained in all things. So you really have a very small piece of a culture that is not willing to change many of its aspects because of outside influences. Otherwise, they would lose their own personal identity. So, in order for one who's growing up in an area like that to have any sort of perspective, it certainly can't be gotten from inside the matrix, if you will. Right?
Well,
They
that's
have to actually get out of it.
what's fascinating is you just brought that, up around the individual identity of a community based on the architecture and the,
Hmm.
the parameters in terms of building and construction and so on. And I was, bringing it right back again to this kid like losing his idea. The fear is when you have engulfment fear, it's almost like you're losing your identity. And so he's moving in a
Mm.
situation. He's moving in with a woman, and at 30 years old, he's running all kinds of fear. And then, of course, he doesn't handle it well. He gets really critical and judgmental. But the fear
Mm.
is almost of losing one's identity, right? And it's
Most of
not,
the time. That's China's issue with foreigners and opening their markets. It's the exact same thing.
They're worried about
verbatim.
losing their identity, so to speak. So
Correct.
this is the challenge, right? Of when you try to live in an open way, right? So because some people are super open, and then you can, lose your identity, so to speak, in that
And it's
openness,
very easy to, but
right?
what's interesting is if your identity is flawed,
Hmm.
what's the problem with losing part of that flaw?
Right.
What's the problem with losing it, right? I
Well, the
mean,
challenge
and
here's right. The
mhm,
challenge is to have enough strength of character, so to speak, enough courage to
yes,
be able to withstand different perspectives, or to be able to change
yes,
aspects of your character that you start to realize are offensive or no longer serving. Right? That's the
damn great
challenge.
point.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. So, um, okay, so in getting back into semantics, which I think is important here, identity, right? I think identity uh I think gets confused and conflated a lot. I think identity gets confused with personas, and I think identity also gets confused with core values, what your
Mm,
core foundational values, and they get interchanged like they are the same thing, and they're completely not. So I think identity and what we're talking about right now are the foundational core values, the ones that, you know, you can live with for life and not have to change if they are good ones. And
mhm,
your personas can change a million times over. You
mhm.
can
Depending on the
change the way
environment you
you
work, yeah,
dress.
right.
Yeah, what kind of
Well,
women you're
depending on,
attracted to, blah,
mhm,
blah, blah. I mean, it can
mhm.
go on to a million different scenarios.
Yeah,
So
so
those things are in flux and it's okay for them to be. But the
well,
core values,
here's,
those have to
like,
be intact and proper.
look, another woman I was working with this morning, she's my age, she's literally 52. And her core
Mm,
values, part of the reason, it's not random who you have chemistry with and who you connect with. And the business that I'm running at the moment is it's very chemistry based in the sense that I'm really guiding people where we like each other and it's a really good fit. Her core
mm,
values are similar to mine. And that's what we were discussing
correct.
this morning. I was discussing my core values are freedom, love, and creativity, which is not
Hmm.
necessarily, it's not like traditionally male, right? Freedom
And
might
kindness.
be,
Yeah.
yeah, freedom, love, creativity, and kindness are my core values, right? I
Mm,
was never oriented towards money, power, status. This woman is a hyper capable woman that makes a lot of, she does very well financially. She's never been dependent on a guy, but she's in a situation where she's in metaphorical jail because she's living with a guy who doesn't make a living, who she's afraid to leave, even though the relationship is dead. And so, even though
mm,
her core value, Tristan, is freedom, she's not living that freedom. And so that's
mm.
where the pain is coming from. So the part of the
Right. And I
pain
was,
comes from,
mm,
right, when you don't live your core values.
yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And you can't test your core values to know if they're good or not unless you're out there exploring. But
Right.
back to, um, so I have a question. Uh, it's getting back to the idea that some people have to go through a traumatic situation or some sort of test in order to get perspective, gain perspective. It's not always in a positive way that you can change somebody, right? So sometimes it has to be a brutal truth. Do you remember the film with Edward Norton, American History X?
Yeah, I like Edward Norton a lot. I just don't remember the details of that film. I mean, it's been probably 20 years
Okay,
or
well,
something, right? Like
he was
that
a
movie
white
came out a while
supremacist,
ago. Right.
etc.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of race issues growing up in these areas in California, a lot of gangs, etc. And there was this hatred for blacks, Hispanics, and everybody not I don't even know what white means, but not a Caucasian uh, individual, I guess, born in America or somewhere in maybe just England. I don't know. I don't know the criteria. So, but the thing is that he ended up getting into this issue where he took this black guy and he put his mouth wide open on the edge of a curb and he jumped up and smashed his head open. I forget if he killed him or not, but he ended up in prison. And in prison, he he was like one of those purebred white supremacists. Don't do
Yeah.
business, don't shake the hand, don't
Wow.
talk to, don't name a child anything that even relates to any
Mm.
African or Jamaican name, whatever. And he found that they were selling drugs amongst each other. So the blacks and the and the Spanish gangs, the Latin gangs, what they were doing, where they were interacting in business, and he got really upset with the head honchos, right, at the prison system, and they ended up turning on him and they ended up raping him.
Mm.
Now, that was brutal for him, obviously, that experience. And he ended up in the laundry room, and he ended up working alongside this other black guy, and they ended up talking, and this black guy ended up protecting him. So he kept fighting because they kept wanting to abuse him. And he found out later this black guy actually protected him. And he
Mm.
started realizing that everything he had been trained to think and had read in all the perspectives were just bunk. They
Yeah,
were pure
exactly.
bullshit.
So, yeah, his
And he,
experience.
but it never would have happened unless he had such a traumatic thing happen, like being raped and turned on by your own, and seeing your own ideology and the people that follow it, and even at the deepest of levels, being hypocritical by interacting in business with people that specifically they shouldn't have been. And him seeing that hypocrisy and those contradictions, and on top of it, being abused by them because of trying to purify his nation, I guess. Uh, and then finding the only one to help him in such a traumatic situation being the enemy, it completely turned his world upside down. But a guy that was so ingrained, such a radical individual, it
It's
only
really,
took that
yeah.
much of a bad situation to happen for him to have that change.
Well, like these things are fascinating when you have this sort of like, synergy, so to speak. Because last night I found myself watching a movie that usually I won't watch late at night because the material is so heavy. But it's called
Mm.
The Forgiven with Forrest Whitaker about Archbishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa and the
Mm.
Reconciliation Commission after apartheid. And the movie
Uh,
that was also
I mean,
about a white
I know the
supremacist.
issue, but I don't know the film.
Well, the film was about a white supremacist that was part of the death squads. And, Desmond Tutu reaches out to him in prison to offer him potential amnesty, even though he slaughtered a lot of black people. And it's a complicated
Mm.
story in the sense that this kid was abused by his own father, but had a crush on a young black girl when he was, like 8 or 10 years old. And then the father went and shot up the little village, and they moved to
Jeez.
Rwanda. It's a heavy story, but it's really
Yeah.
about apartheid, and but more specifically, it's about exactly what you just brought up about how it takes sometimes really powerful experiences and really out of the box experiences to like it. Sometimes it takes catastrophe, and
Yes.
in order for you to let go of rigid or fixed beliefs and ideology, like like
Exactly.
like white nationalism
Like
or
what
racism or
what is it?
like
Hades and Horus, right? The sun goes up and the night comes in, and there were these wars between Hades and Horus every single day on who would win to take over. And that's where you got, Hades bringing in the night and Horus bringing in the day. And there is something fascinating. I mean, how long does it take to build uh I don't know, let's say a company like Apple, or how long does it take to build 10,000 square foot home. And then how fast can it be destroyed?
Yeah,
So,
well, probably 2 years for
it,
the home,
yeah,
and it can be
it's so
destroyed
imagine,
in 2 hours, right? And
yeah.
for Apple, I guess 20 years, and I don't know. Apple's a behemoth. I have no idea how long you destroy that one, how long that one takes.
Well,
But yeah, but it's a
if
good
there was a
metaphor.
if
It's a
there was
really
a
good
significant yeah, if there was a significant innovation, or there was, this kind of Mark
you know,
Zuckerberg
a quantum
issue,
iPhone, right? If we had a
yeah,
quantum
privacy
phone
issue,
instead of
yeah,
right instead of
yeah,
an iPhone, we had a quantum phone, right? And
right,
then
they would be
Apple's out of
named this
business.
very yeah, they would be turned into a utility company like
Yeah.
Microsoft was, and
I
finally is
mean,
trying to transition out of. But
but
getting
this
back to it,
speaks to yeah, but this speaks to character and how important, because I often talk about integrity.
well,
One of
right, let me
yeah,
finish.
yeah.
Let me so if you build a character for 20 years and it's been built on an ideology and a family of people that believe in that ideology, that's deep, man. I mean, it's in your fingernails. It's so deep. It's very, very hard to just mentor someone out of that in a session by session basis. The only way that it can happen is to blow it up.
Hmm.
And because time is critical, you don't have another 20 years to try to change it. It's got to be done immediately, especially if there is some genocide happening because of it. It's got to be blown up. It's got to be severed immediately, and the only way that can happen is something extremely drastic, because it's the only way you can uncondition 20 years of conditioning.
Right.
So
Well, I
in
mean,
that situation, what's the solution? I mean, you can't do certain things. It's not humanitarian. So what would you do to rid such an evil, let's say, from a white supremacist, without a drastic uh, situation like a rape in prison or being turned on by his own?
well, look, in doing psychology and coaching, one of the things you learn, and this from the just living life, right, from people that you've
Mm.
hired that have worked for you, right? Unless someone is willing to change, it's not happening, right? So if they're not
Well, that's
open
the
to
thing.
change,
It,
it doesn't
yeah, but
happen
these characters
unless
weren't willing. The
well,
forces forced them.
unless something outside becomes a major
Oh,
catalyst. So, for
yes.
instance, like in a marriage, when one partner is unwilling to change and the other person leaves that person, that often can be the catalyst for change,
Significant enough.
right?
Right.
So,
Yeah,
in other
I
words, so
agree.
when I'm working with somebody and they're trying to say, well, this, my partner, or, whether it's a business partner or a love relationship, my partner won't change. So, blah, blah, blah. They won't do this. What I mean? And they're abusive, or they're this, or they're that, or whatever it is. I'm like, we bring it back to you. And what about you? What are you doing in a situation that has you feeling so stuck? In other words,
Right.
you change, right? And when you change, sometimes, here's the critical word, right? Sometimes the other party changes. A lot of times,
Right.
if you talk to like, a health coach or something, right? A lot of
Mm.
times, like someone will have a heart attack. If you take 10 people that have a heart attack, three or four will keep smoking after the heart attack. In other
Oh,
words,
yes.
even the heart attack's not
Sure.
enough to get them to stop. Yeah, it's a large percentage of people won't change their habits even
Majority,
after
yeah, for sure.
a catastrophe. So even the person that gets raped, some people get bitter and then don't learn or grow from it. Other people go,
Right.
okay, I got to look at things differently here.
Well, that's something interesting. So here's how I would connect that to your foundational blocks that you're built with. Certain things trigger a deep rooted core change, and not everyone is built the same. So
Hmm.
with one individual, it can be the witnessing the masters of your ideology being hypocritical and contradictory, and you witnessing it. Another one could be a demasculinization, like a rape, for example, an invasion of your personal self. Another one can be a you know, something that affects something you never had in your life, which is someone who loved you. Your parents never loved you, but this is the first woman that loved you, and she's left you now. You know,
Mm,
there everyone has a different catalyst that can work, and there isn't one size fits all solution. So
mhm,
that's tricky because some situations are very complicated and you can't put everyone in situations that can create the change necessary. And it's also difficult to figure out what is the catalyst that will work for those individuals, right?
mhm.
I mean, your job is insanely difficult.
Well, that, that's really well, it's challenging for sure. I mean, you have to be pretty creative interpersonally, right? Because what you just mentioned is really, really hits to the heart of it. Because, often people say that, that, you have to change you. But sometimes, believe it or not, changing the environment can be a catalyst for changing you. So, because
Yes.
people will argue that, well, if you get up and move, then, I mean, if you're running away. Well,
You're yes.
that might be the case some of the time, but some of the time you're taking yourself out of an abusive environment or out of a closed environment or out of a narrow environment and putting yourself into a more open or more supportive or more encouraging environment. And then that becomes the catalyst for change.
Yes. I
So
mean,
so these things are actually
so
tricky, right? It's not
yeah.
straightforward. There is no black and white one fit all answer, so to speak.
Right.
One fits
We
all.
can agree with the running away from your problems aspect for sure, right? I mean,
Well,
for example, let's
sometimes
say
you're
let's say
running
there's a
towards
guy
stuff,
who's
right?
well, let's say there's a guy who's uh, very mischievous in the business world. He's always cutting corners, cheating people,
Character.
figuring out ways to,
Right.
yeah, yeah. So he runs away from, I don't know, New York because of legal issues, and he can't, or maybe even the States, and he ends up in Europe. He's going to do the same thing in Europe because it's how he knows how to do business and survive. So he is just, the environment of Europe is not going to change him. The environment of a like society is not going to change him. But if he went into China and tried to play by those same rules, it would be a very different animal. But what's interesting is that man won't move to China because he knows his way and his character won't survive there.
Very
So,
fascinating. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So
So a lot
when
of
someone
people will
has
just
like,
throw out there, move, and it's like,
hmm
well, where is a place that doesn't accept your character? That's
hmm
where you want to move,
hmm yeah.
which is
Well,
talking
and
about
it's
getting out of your
interesting.
comfort
Well,
zone.
and
That's
it's
what it really
interesting
is.
that your example is the shady character, and I literally would give the opposite example, right? So if you
Yeah.
take a shady character, so to speak, and you stick him in, a different environment, he's going to be shady, most likely going to be shady in that new environment. But what I'm
Or if
talking
he's a
about here,
massive,
yeah,
womanizer. I mean, he's
or
going to do the
right,
same thing in all
shady,
countries.
yeah, shady character, so to speak. But what I'm
Yeah.
actually referencing is something quite different, where
You know, I
someone
always go
is
to the negative,
suppressed. Yeah, you're going, yeah, exactly. Well, I'm talking about someone who's
which is why you're a good
suppressed,
balance.
right? But I'm actually talking about someone who's suppressed. Like, let's just say you're like super open minded, creative, maybe artistic, and you're in a super conservative, buttoned up environment, and
Hmm.
then you decide to leave that environment, there's a good chance you're going to be judged for running away when you're actually moving towards something that's healthy
Oh,
for
you just,
your personality
yeah,
or character.
it's perfect
See
because
it?
you just said a conservative environment, which means he has to go to another environment that doesn't accept conservative thought, which is the same thing as going to China for that, corrupt businessman who doesn't
They won't accept it.
accept.
Right.
Yeah, so you actually have to define what it is that you are, and you have to move to a place that is exactly the opposite and unaccepting or unsympathetic to those ways.
Well, I think what we're
Would you
really
agree?
talking about Well, what we're really talking about is, personal growth, right? And,
Absolutely.
some people do personal growth and they decide that there are parts of who they are that they either don't like, aren't comfortable with, or have some desire to change. And I say some desire because when people enter personal growth journeys, they don't always embrace it. They think that maybe they can just change little things here and there,
Right.
and often that's not the case, right? Because if you have integrity issues, if you have a shady character, that's highly problematic, you know? And so that's the kind of
Well,
thing,
I think
like,
most human beings have a part of themselves that has, negative aspects. I mean, we're not.
no, what I'm
I mean,
saying
we've
is,
got
yeah,
issues. Yeah,
no, everybody has issues. I understand that, but some issues are way more intense and severe than others.
true.
If you lie,
So,
cheat,
would
and
you say
steal,
the first
if
goal
like
is to identify what it is you are exactly?
Well, I mean, it will identify what it is, who you are, what you're about, and why you're here, and what you want is part of
Well,
that
that's
personal growth experience. What's that?
yeah, but that's huge because if you need to create change, so okay, so if you have an issue,
Who are
identify the
you?
issue, number one,
Well,
and then
who?
why is it
Yeah,
that you have that issue? What is it about your character that is that issue? And then figuring out, let's say, an environment that is exactly the opposite and unsympathetic to it, right? Because otherwise, you wouldn't know where to go. You wouldn't know what environment to change to.
yeah, and again, it's not like a black or white. It's not extreme. Like it's a
Absolutely not.
gradual,
I mean,
right? It's like
we're
a
giving hard
gradual,
examples so we can illuminate
right?
it for
Well,
everybody else.
like for example, someone that somehow winds up alone every 2 years, right? No matter what they do, no matter how they try to
Right.
create a relationship, they find themselves
Interesting
alone
example.
again or divorced
Yep.
again. Like Larry King was
Yeah, for
divorced 10 or
sure. We
11
know many
times,
people
right?
like that.
Some people are divorced, 4 or 5, 6 times. You have to ask the
Yeah.
question, why are you remarrying? Like, what's the rush? Right? But it's not just that.
Exactly.
You find yourself alone every 2 or 3 or 4 years, and that's a
Yeah, you're
pattern,
repeating
right?
the same pattern.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's complicated because there's a lot of judgment in that. Because sometimes it's actually healthy to not be in a rush to get married if you're not ready to have a family, right? So
Yes.
even that one is not black or white. But the part about being alone,
Well,
right? If
no,
you
we've
don't
got the
like
core
being alone,
fundamental. I mean, I don't think
right?
we're getting confused here. I think we have the core fundamentals here. The core
Well,
fundamentals are,
yeah, yeah.
it is black and white, the core fundamentals of you have an issue, that issue in your environment is sympathetic to it, figuring it out, going to an environment that is unsympathetic to it to get perspective on it, whether it's you or the environment that is making these issues arise.
Yeah, and I would say it's the opposite, Tristan. I would say for the vast majority of people, they're not going to go to an unsympathetic environment. It doesn't really work that way. Meaning,
Correct.
like the
So,
vast majority of people aren't going to, put themselves in the Peace Corps in a small village in
correct.
Rwanda or the Cameroon to figure out, who they really are on a deep characterological level. It's too hard,
So now,
right?
so now I
So,
have, so now I
yeah.
have a question for you. So if
Hmm.
that's the case, if
Hmm.
that's the case, which is I mean, fundamentally the right way, and the only way to completely, radically uh, rid yourself of that, whatever it is, would you say then the other personal growth, yes, it is percentage wise better, but it's certainly not going to be a holistic approach. It's certainly not going to be a complete panacea, right? It won't do that because there's only one way to actually do it, right? Which I
Well, there is.
believe that anyone and anyone can agree. And I think that so
Well, there
this
is no
means that they
radical
would
in the
have to
per.
do it.
Yeah,
mm,
it doesn't
they
really
would have to
work that
do it
way. Yeah.
themselves in the environment, little step by little step, but they're never going to have the complete outside perspective because they
Well,
haven't been outside the environment that's unsympathetic to it. So it's, I mean, you have
again, I
blinders
mean,
on.
I don't, look, I look, I don't, I look at these things as like continuum and as a journey. because
No, yeah, for
in the
sure, for
in
sure.
right, because in the world
I
of the thousands of people that I've come across and helped
no, I
and
just I
guided,
just wanted to make
right?
clear like the 100% example, the 0% example, and
Yeah, but
everything in between.
you look, there are
Like these are
people,
the
the
boundaries,
100%.
right?
Well, the 100% example, like, is someone literally that joins the Peace Corps, winds up in a small village, far outside the capital of Libya or far outside the capital of Cameroon, and radically
Mm,
alters their environment in a way that they don't have running water, they don't have they don't have toilets, they
yep,
literally, they don't have a language, a common language, and they have to figure it out. That
yep.
forces one to really self-examine on a level that few people actually do. One guy,
Yes.
one
It's
Buddhist,
potent, right?
yeah, well,
I
but
mean,
that is very
it's such a
rare.
condensed
Yeah,
self-growth, strategy.
yeah, and that's like probably less than 1 in 10,000, right? I mean, or 1 in 100,000, whatever it is. It's a
Oh,
small
absolutely.
number. It's a very small number.
Yeah.
I remember running across a
You are
Buddha.
rare. You are rare, and I think I'm rare. Like you always use the word outlier. I can say that we've done this ourselves multiple times.
Yeah,
So
I mean, at this stage, I'm grateful that I'm not living in a small village outside of the capital, Cameroon, because when you get older, you just want some comfort. But anyway,
well, whoa. Let me bring it back to something small and relatable.
yeah,
You do it constantly because, for example, you have had your entire life an aversion to technology because you're a sports guy and a heart-based guy, and technology just feels empty. And you've worn that hat multiple times and jumped out of your comfort zone, jumped into a world that you have you've always felt a disliking for. You felt it was empty. It didn't. There were many valueless propositions in that regard, as you saw it. And guess what? Through that journey, you've now made it where even the other day there was some issue on the phone and you're like, oh yeah, I'm actually I had figured that out, and you had read the documentation on it, and you've gotten more used to going about it that way because it makes your life easier, and it makes you feel better afterwards. So even in something small like that, you're constantly doing it, you're constantly changing your environment and way of thought. So it doesn't have to be changing country,
yeah.
right?
So,
But
thank you. I appreciate the acknowledgement. But again, this is that principle that you and I often talk about. We go back and forth on this one. The willingness to kind of to get out of your comfort zone, to do it differently, to communicate differently, to share, whether it's learning new technology or embracing change, right? That
mm,
style of living, it's very powerful, right? Because like
very,
the metaphor is like the tree that's rigid is going to break in the wind, right? It's going to snap.
yes,
And like
yes,
the ability to be what, I often say, when I get involved with a new client, I got my end covered. I'm going to be hyper flexible here. We
yep,
can figure this thing out. I don't have to
yes,
do 60 minutes. It can be half hour. It can be 45 minutes. It can be once a week,
right,
once a month, twice a week. In other words, we can figure
right.
this thing
Remote,
out
in
based
person,
remote, in
exactly.
person. We can figure this thing out, if you're ready on your end, if you're willing on your
Exactly.
end. We got this thing covered. So there's something very
Now,
powerful, as you know, right?
mm,
That about being hyper flexible, right?
yes, you know about plants, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you know that if you have a plant that has grown up indoors, it doesn't have strong wind, it doesn't have it has unnatural sunlight, unnatural feeding, etc., and then you plant it outside, it's going to die immediately.
Right.
So the reason is because its stem base is weak. And why? Because it hasn't had the wind whipping it, backward and forward all the
Interesting.
time, and it doesn't build stronger stems.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have the ability to starve itself of water for a prolonged period of time because it hasn't been conditioned to that. So it's a much weaker plant. So the rougher the conditions a plant lives in, the stronger it can survive any conditions in the future, right? So
I'm
it's
smiling
the
because my wife doesn't water the plants, and I'm sitting here going, "Well, maybe our plants are like, like ours could be an exception here. If I'm traveling, our plants are an exception. I don't know if she waters them.
very,
Anyway, go ahead.
very so,
But yeah, that's a pretty
so
good metaphor. Yeah,
right. So I think that if if most people think of themselves in this regard, you your job is to stress yourself or put yourself in challenging situations as much as humanly possible in order to see what you can withstand, in order to see how you react, how your character adapts to it or how it doesn't adapt to it. Otherwise, you have made the unknown future a risk, a much greater risk to yourself and to the ones around you.
yeah. Yeah, so that's a personality trait or a character trait as well, right? Your adaptability, your level of adaptability, and your level of flexibility, right?
Mm,
It is something old dogs can learn new tricks, but it's pretty rare. And so I
yeah,
playfully say, I often teach people how to accept their parents for who they are because often their parents are old dogs and they're
mm,
unlikely to change. And so
right.
what we work on is acceptance, which is a form of change in the younger dog, right?
Well,
Because
would you agree that every single human being that ever was and ever is and ever will be has one common trait, which is they don't want to die. So that means that survivability is critical, and it's a innate reaction. It's something that you are born with. It's a
well, I think we're
right.
genetically
So
programmed for survival, but I do think that
correct.
our enlightened masters, I do believe there are a
But
few
my point
thousand
is
people
this,
that aren't worried about dying. That
right? So my well,
have no fear. I do
what?
believe out of
No, no,
7.5
no. I'm
billion
not.
people, there's a few thousand
But
that probably have
yes,
no
but I
fear.
wouldn't agree that those people that don't have fear of dying do not try to live.
Like, remember this book, Paramahansa Yogananda, Autobiography of a Yogi? When he was 59
I
years old, he left his body, right?
mm,
And, it was preserved for months, like perfectly preserved
mm,
for months. So I
mm.
do think it is possible to achieve states of enlightenment where,
No, no, no.
death becomes
I'm not
something
talking
different.
about state.
Yeah,
I'm not talking
yeah.
about like a fearless state in regard to, this life and an afterlife. I'm talking about that if you are here, you're not going to sit and not feed yourself, not drink water, not interact with the social environment, not kill the spider that's crawling up your wall, whatever. You're going to interact with your environment. You're not going to just stand still. So in other words, you're trying to live whatever life is. So
Yeah,
what that means
for,
is
for the
if you're
vast
trying
majority
to
of
live,
people, that's true. Yeah.
right. Well, I would say all people. No one just sits, right? Unless they have some issue where they're in a vegetative state. So if
Well,
that's
some
the
people
case,
do,
that
some
means that
people,
everybody has that
yeah,
ability
yeah.
innately and they're born with it. So if they just throw themselves into as many environments as humanly possible, challenge themselves, it will happen naturally because they will need to survive. They will try to survive. They're not going to just end up in an environment and then just say, screw it and die and just sit in a corner somewhere. They will try, and that trying will allow them to grow. So, my point is that it can happen for 100% of people.
Yeah, the only reason that I'm, like not agreeing 100% with you is just because I think of, there are people that do hunger strikes and, consciously choose. There were people in Vietnam that, some of the Buddhists that self-immolated, I mean, they poured gasoline, they stayed in a meditative state and never moved as their bodies burnt themselves alive. So there are
Yes,
situations where
they
people
willingly,
consciously
they
choose.
willingly did it.
Yes, exactly. So there are
But that
situations where
was
people
also a
do
different
hunger
state.
strikes. Well, there people will do hunger strikes and things where they decide that their principles transcend their body or whatever their genetic
That's
desire
that's
to
that's so
survive.
that's so beautiful because that is beautiful. The Buddhists had done that for others to make life of others better, to change a totalitarian system, a way
Hmm.
of being,
To bring awareness
or
to suffering. Exactly.
yes. So they sacrificed themselves. So that was
Yeah.
obviously out of their comfort zone, and obviously,
I mean, I
um,
just, it's sort of extraordinary, but it really is extraordinary what's possible. I mean, right?
correct.
That's
But they
also,
did it for others, so they were still
yes,
interacting with the environment and doing it
mm-hmm,
for the betterment of the environment, and
100%.
still
Yeah,
being uh, um, uh, affected by the environment all the way up until the end.
100%. Yeah, that's 100%
So
accurate. But
yeah,
that's a
so
kind
even
of
though they were able to
character,
die,
you know,
mm,
but that coming full circle, that character
yeah,
trait, the courage that a very small percentage of people have,
oh yeah,
tremendous
yeah, yeah, yeah.
courage, right? Outlier levels of courage, right? The
Well, that's
ability,
why I brought it back
like,
to the technology thing.
yeah,
You did it in a technology thing. I think that's a harmless thing. I think most people
I
can
think
do that.
living in China was more challenging
Oh yeah,
than figuring out the cameras.
exactly, exactly. So that I think bringing it to small examples is if you illuminate the idea that they're fundamentals that don't change in human nature. We're affected by our environment. We want to affect the environment, and we also we change and adapt no matter where we are. So if that's the case, then everyone is able to do these steps in order to rectify whatever issues they currently have or biases they currently have in their closed environments.
Yeah, so look, so here's the challenge, right? And there are exceptions. There are vegetative schizophrenics and people that are so
Yes,
physically or
exactly.
mentally ill that they're not going to be able to affect change. I've met those people.
Yes.
But for the vast majority of people, you want to look at things like, the reinforcers and the enabling of bad behavior, right? Because a
I
lot of
love
times
that.
when people don't change, there's something
Yeah,
in place that's allowing them to not change, like
exactly.
wealthy parents that are super enabling, that kind of thing, right?
Yes, I
Like a
love
kid
that
that's
point.
living in his parents' basement, in his mom's basement, 35 years old, that's smart and capable, that's getting stoned every day and isn't freaking doing anything with his life. Well, he's
Yep.
living in his, mom's basement. She's not telling him he has to get a job or anything, and or his
Yeah,
dad's
he's not
right.
being forced to, fall back to his survival instincts.
Yeah, or
So
forced
they're
to
not
grow
forced.
up, right? Or
Well,
forced to
no,
grow up,
because if he didn't
right?
have if he didn't have his mother taking care of him, he has to jump to that, human nature aspect of, oh, I need to survive now. I got to figure this thing out. And that, kicks you into high gear. In that is very particular. But if
No, that's
it's not
very
being
powerful.
used, or
Look,
that
I've
muscle
been,
is not being exercised, it's a
yeah,
problem.
I've been through a lot of trauma, as you know, and I'm aware of that survival instinct. So, I
Yeah.
agree with you 100%. It can and does kick in gear. But again, when you're working with people, the tricky part is to identify all these different reinforcers, right? Or
Yes.
things that
Identifying.
enable, right? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like and also like if you're dealing with people that have drug and alcohol issues or smoking issues or whatever, often there's all kinds of catalysts and triggers, right? So
Right.
behavior change, as you know, is super, super tricky, right? Because there's
Yes.
a lot of moving parts. Character is an aspect of it, right? But other aspects of it are the environment, the reinforcers, right?
Yeah, actually, I have a question for you. Do you think
Yeah.
that it's more difficult to identify the issues, the underlying issues, than it is to create the change for them?
Well, look, I mean, I think people vary on their level of openness. That's a personality construct, right? Some people are
Hmm.
more, and people vary on their level of self awareness to begin with. there's some people
Mm,
that I playfully refer to as rockheads. You know what I mean? You're like,
mm,
literally, they have very little or no self awareness. Like, you say
mhm.
something that seems basic, and it's like, like never thought of it once in their life, right?
Right.
And there, like, literally, there are people out there that
No,
literally
I know.
never
I know.
thought of basic
Certain cultures. There are
personal,
many things
yeah.
in China which I know a bit about, where the kids or even the adults have never asked themselves certain questions, like what is a real friend? What does it mean to be a friend? Or when is strength stronger than a muscle? Right.
Yeah, or
So
like, or mental
they've
health
never asked
issues,
themselves.
right? Or
Yeah,
mental health issues in China, like, you know what I mean?
exactly.
Have you ever been depressed? Like, they may never
Right.
ask that question, right?
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah.
So
So
asking the question gives you insight, or at least the idea to start asking yourself, huh, what does that mean? And what does it mean to me? Right. So identifying it is the journey, and the correcting of it, I would assume, from my own experience, I find is easier than the actual journey
that
of identifying it.
that's hilarious
And they're
because
both extremely different.
I'm laughing because it's hilarious because I've worked with so many people over so long, and some people are tremendously good at, like, identifying their issues, and they almost never do anything about it. Literally, I can
Mhm.
think of a bunch of kids right now where it's like they know their issues, they're just not changing, right? And that's why I laugh, because in other issues,
Well,
other people identifying
that's a
it
good point.
is a struggle, right? So
That's
for
a
some
very good
people, so it really does vary a lot, not a little bit. So again, some people are far more self-aware to start with, and some people are really, like, they just never had the mentoring, guidance, or discussions. They never had them.
Let me play devil's
Yeah,
advocate with you on that one,
yeah.
because that's very interesting. So they identify with it, they know the issue, but they just don't change for whatever reasons. Does that mean that it's been identified correctly? Because
Well,
here's so let me finish.
yeah.
So if somebody identifies it and they see it, but they really don't know the depth of it and how damning it actually is. It hasn't registered in their mind. There's a reason it hasn't registered in their mind, and that is something that has not been identified. Why
Yeah,
is
and
there a
so
block to the true understanding of how serious it is? Because then the change would be a survive. It would go back to survivability, where they would be
well, I
forced
mean, look, I
to
mean,
go
you're
into survival mode.
well, again, you're bringing up an excellent point. It's really, interesting that you're, making it a deeper, more dynamic discussion that in that way. I
Mm,
agree. I agree with you that on some level, the suggesting that they're not really, fully aware of the issue if they're not changing it, as it
mm,
can occur.
mm.
But we're going to come right back to environment. If the environment is enabling, it doesn't
Yes,
matter. It's allowing them to not go to the next level of depth, right? Because
exactly. So it's
because they can
catch
get
22.
away with superficially understanding something, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I know that, I need to make some changes. I need to get a freaking job, or, I need to exercise instead of take meds that aren't effective, or whatever it is,
Mm,
right?
mm,
But if the
mm,
environment allows them to not get the job, or to not get off their duff, or to not make
mm,
real changes, then they could
mm.
superficially be aware, but on some deeper level, they're not confronted with the full truth. And the full truth is often that people are way more capable of change than they give themselves credit for.
True, true. And it's a society, it seems, mission to make people weaker than, or think they're weaker than they actually are. But very interesting. So let's take your example where you have the individual, they're in this environment, and they know their issue, that a solution is to get out of the environment so it doesn't re enable these bad habits, but they're not going to do that. Okay, well,
Nope.
why aren't they going to do that? There must be
Is it?
something else identifiable that it gets deeper than just that issue they're trying to change
Well,
for the
there's this
environment.
concept in psychology called secondary gain, right? So some people are gaining attention by being ill, right? Some people
Ah,
are legitimately depressed, right?
I
But
love
other
that.
people are
Yes,
actually gaining attention for consistently acting depressed or not getting
exactly.
themselves unstuck. So that's why psychology is often complicated. Because
Yeah,
for example, depression can be biochemical. Sometimes it can be so insidious and so dark and so deep. I've been through this, so real that it's not about the environment reinforcing it. It's about that you're chemically messed up, right? That can
yes,
happen. But
yes,
oftentimes personality can influence recovery, right? So
absolutely.
right? So in other words, if you're getting a lot of secondary gain, then you become attached to that secondary gain. Now you've got a real problem,
So if
right?
you identify with a client the
Mm-hmm.
secondary gain aspect of it, which is another
Mm-hmm.
issue, in order to
Mm-hmm.
fix the issue you started with, it's a deeper issue.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that the individuals say, "Oh, wow, that's kind of sick," and then you lay out how bad it is for not only themselves but the environment around them, or if they have children, my God, the knowledge they're passing on to others, because most kids learn by action, not necessarily by words. They learn by their parents' actions. So
100%. Yeah.
when you lay it out clearly and identify these things, do you find that they start worrying about it more?
Well, it's really something more like this. It's really the vast majority of people, and I think you might agree with this, Tristan. The
Mm,
vast majority of people only change because they have to. And what I try to live and teach is to
mm.
actually embrace change as a way of living,
Yeah,
right?
instead of it having to, but wanting to.
Exactly. And so the challenge in helping, guiding, mentoring, doing psychology and sports psychology, one of the reasons why I love athletes so much is they're more likely to embrace change because their commitment to excellence is so high in their
Right.
sport, they're willing to do things that other people might not be willing to do. Work harder,
Right.
so to speak. Right?
Yes.
So
Do you
that's
remember
the
Joe Rogan talking about climbing the mountain dunes barefoot? He was talking about some guy that was like a UFC trainer or MMA trainer, and what he would do every single morning, he would get up at like 3 or something, and then just run up and down these, sand dunes, sand barefoot. And he's like, he would do this for 2 or 3 hours. That is, he said, that's at a level I'm just not at yet.
totally.
Yet.
Yeah. What?
It was fascinating.
'Cause I work with a lot of physical specimens, and one of the things I say all the time is, I'm not swimming across the English Channel. I'll drown somewhere, 300, 400 yards in, or maybe a mile in, or whatever it is. But I'm
Right.
tough. But I'm tough emotionally. In other words, I'm not afraid of getting hurt. And I've worked with a lot of physically buffed human beings that are terrified of getting hurt emotionally. In other words, they're in
Yeah.
a relationship and they're scared of getting hurt. And so there's these
Mhm.
things that I always make it deeper than just the physical, right? Because our
Of
culture
course.
often we look at these, we look at athletes and physical specimens and, mental and
It's a
physical
part of
toughness,
materialism, right?
right?
Of
We
physical
look at this sort of
materialism.
mental toughness, but there's this thing about emotional toughness, especially around intimacy, right? Coming full circle around this kid
Mhm.
where we started our conversation an hour ago or so around a
Yes.
kid that really is afraid. Ultimately, he's afraid of getting hurt and he acts out in all these different ways in order to avoid getting hurt. He gets critical, he gets judgmental, he pushes her away. Now, why does that happen? If we look into his past, because she's told me a little bit about his past, right? He pretty much didn't have a father, and his mother would come and go in his life. So, in other words,
Mm.
his model of emotional intimacy was screwy. So, he would
He's
be
afraid of
both.
he's afraid of loss as well.
Exactly. So he would be both loved, and when he was loved, my guess is he was probably smothered in that loved, and then he was abandoned. And so he's
Yeah.
replaying those early childhood dynamics out in this love relationship,
Yeah,
20,
because
30,
he's with
20,
her
30 years
now,
later.
and and he's projecting the idea that she's going to disappear or leave him or do something bad. So then he, projects, so he ends up acting out angrily towards her, or
Exactly.
uh
Or he feels smothered by
accusing
her.
her of certain things or
Mhm.
whatever it is, because he's playing it out in his head that this is going to happen, and meanwhile it never happened. It hasn't
E-
happened yet, but he's going to make it
Exactly.
happen. He's going to manifest it.
Exactly. And a lot of times this process is deeply unconscious, right? Because when you haven't self-reflected, I mean, he's a business
You haven't
person.
identified, right?
Right. Well, he's a business person and an athlete. He's never had psychology or coaching, right? So
Hmm.
he's never really dealt with his own emotional issues around closeness. So I
Mm,
often say that, you know what I mean, that like it's great that you can swim across the English Channel, you can do, run an ultra marathon or something. But
mm,
what about communication and what about emotional growth and about intimacy? Can you do that as well? And so to
mm.
me, my guidance with these athletes, I'm helping them communicate at a much higher level, right? Become more self-aware, deal with closeness issues. And the cool thing is, it actually helps them become better athletes, right? Because
Oh,
they
yeah.
get tougher emotionally around relationship, and then they actually have less fear everywhere. It's pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, and it also makes them tougher in their own sport and more adaptable to change and
Exactly.
correcting whatever issues they have in their sport itself. I mean,
100%. And we live in a culture where there's not a lot of that, Tristan. There really isn't. It's like how many people are
no.
actually teaching athletes to be emotionally tough around
I
communication and intimacy? Seriously.
I mean, there are books here and there, and
Yeah.
maybe a podcast that reaches 100 people, or they don't even spend a lot of time and energy doing it, because how many doctors like you are actually saying, "Hey, let me help everyone else i- in the hundreds, thousands to millions for free. Let me not get paid for my time." And how many actually say, I just want to give back in that way? I mean, that's nil to none,
Mm,
nil to none.
yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you're obviously a rare specimen, but it's part of your journey of, in my opinion, of saying, I've learned these things that have helped me and helped me help my clients over, 20 or 30 years now. And I want to, give back, and I don't need something in return for it, because the return I get is that I know I've, created positive change in as many people as possible. So it's not 100% selfless, but it's from a positive way that just means a lot to me. I mean, so
Well, I
obviously
mean,
you've
look, I mean,
identified your journey.
yeah. So look, if you notice the way you're wired as well, part of the reason that we're buddies is that you are wired towards other and contribution, not just self.
Mhm.
And it's a really tricky dynamic, right? Because often we live in a culture that goes me, right? And it's not like
Yes.
not no, look, not
The
everybody is
world.
that way. They're like, well, often, yeah, the world can be that way. And so,
Mhm.
that's the tricky part, right? The tricky part is balancing self and other and putting it together in a way where you're honoring yourself, but you're aware of other people's process, you're taking care of other people as well, but not at the detriment of self. And that
Right.
dynamic is super, super tricky for a lot of people. All the athletes I'm working with, it's not easy for them. It's not easy for almost anyone, mostly because we're just not mentored that way, right? We're not guided,
Exactly. We're not
right?
educated that way. Yeah.
Exactly. We're not really learning how to sort of balance self and other. You sent me a podcast on Tulsi Gabbard, and she talked about service, right? And
Mhm.
and politicians are tricky because you don't when they're politicians you don't know if it's
If
always
it's
the
a fiction
truth.
or if
Yeah,
it's
but
true.
she seemed so sincere, right? Her history is,
She does
very
seem sincere.
significant. Yeah, her history
Yeah.
is very significant in terms of serving her country, you know. and
Yeah,
and
I
I
mean, the energy, like her aura around her
oh
when
yeah,
she
it seems
speaks,
she
it's
seems
very
so crazy authentic. It's nuts. And you and I have
yeah.
radar for authenticity, right? It's like
Oh, yeah,
it's
for sure.
automatic radar or whatever. But again, instead of service to self, right? Can we find a way to honor ourselves and yet serve others? And that's the sort of
Exactly.
like, you know, awesome but
And that's a
sometimes
beautiful
tricky
thing
part.
because that's a beautiful thing in the sports arena because a true athlete has fans. He has
Yeah.
followers. He has his teammates. He has his coaches, and he wants them to be better off and get recognition and have a better experience. Or if a player plays so damn well and his coach is like, "Wow, those changes we did and my mentorship really improved this individual," he knows he gets positive feedback for that. So a real pupil or protege is always a better one when he's trying to make his master, or mentor, proud, because he's doing it for him. He knows when he goes out, it's a honor and respect for the people that have trained him coming before him. That
Hmm.
gives him more of a drive than just a self drive, which makes him
Yeah.
that much more, powerful and hard to defeat and take down.
Yeah, I mean, there's something amazing, right, about the relatively selfless warrior, relatively selfless
Mm,
athlete, relatively selfless person. We can identify that pretty quickly, right? Because
yes.
we're often so used to the opposite, where too many people you can sort of sense their ulterior motive, and when someone's very
Yes.
pure in their desire to play on that team and contribute to the team and be part of the team and have the team spirit be primary and to win as a team,
Mm,
you can all it's hard not to truly love that person, right?
yes.
The Russell
Yeah, and it
Wilson
seems like
type that you just he's not making stuff up about team.
right.
For him, team is part of who he is. And
Yeah.
there's something,
Eh,
I, I can sense that immediately when I start working with people, what I call whether they care about my soul as well, right?
mm,
You know that when you work with other people, right? When you're
yes.
involved with other players, one of the
Me
executives one of the executives I'm coaching, he's building a new team, right? And he's in a big organization, so it's a little bit tricky, right? Because
how
you
many
can't
people?
just I mean, he's running like I think it's several thousand, but the
Wow,
organization
that's
itself is far. Yeah, the organization itself is far bigger than that, and he's got an
yeah,
executive
but that's
team.
what he has his hand on.
Exactly, he's got an executive team that he's putting together, and one of the players is not a team player. And I've asked him from the beginning to more or less get rid of her because she's not a fit, and it's unlikely at 55 years old or whatever she is, she's going to suddenly change her character and become a team
Right,
player. The possibility of
right.
that is slim to none because we've lived a lot of life. And the challenge in a
Yes.
large organization is it's not so straightforward. It's not, there's protocol and all
Yeah.
this other stuff, but it's already starting to
Yep.
work out in a way where he got wind of the fact that she's interviewing elsewhere. And so that's now a
Mm,
catalyst for him to make the change. But the real change is if you're building an elite team, you can't have non-team players on an elite team and create
yeah,
that wonderful energy, right?
you can't have someone that's, bringing in division and dissent because it will infect
One
others.
person can rot, literally one bad apple, right? In a police force, right? If 10% are causing harm, that's really bad. Let's just say it's a
Yes,
small
I mean,
police force. It's just 50
yeah,
people, in a small town, 50 police officers. If five of those police officers are rotten, that's going to affect the entire police force.
yes. I love the old adage that says you're only as strong as your weakest link. And people don't really grasp that. It's,
Yeah.
I mean, word for word, just honest, true, and extremely important to understand
Hmm.
that, you really, no matter how you dice it, no matter if it's a small team, a big team, a wife and a husband, a parent, mother and father and their kids, uh, or husband and their kids, whatever. The point is that you literally are only as strong as your weakest link, and it's a duty of everyone in the team to rectify that and correct the weakest link, either to make them stronger or simply to replace them. Because
100%.
you
100%.
can't
You
you
know,
can't you can't live with that division and dissent. It will destroy you.
yeah, I mean, one of the kids I've got it on and off, just went through Hell Week as a Navy SEAL, and I'm gonna, send him a text later today to find out how it went. But I
Mm,
immediately think of SEAL training. It's so severe because they
mm,
cannot afford to have any weak link, right? At that level, it's so elite and so dangerous and so important that they can't afford even the tiniest of a weak link. So the experience of buds is just insanely like challenging, right? Because they're not
right.
going to take any risk on any weak link. Now that's obviously an
Yes.
extreme example of what you're sharing, but on a baseball
And a great
team,
example to give. Yeah.
yeah, but on the baseball team, right? One player that is doesn't have his head in the game or whatever can, wreck can lose a game for you, especially if you're in the playoffs or something, right?
He's
One
wrecking the
player that,
morale of the team.
yeah, one guy that's checked out or doing drugs or something or not, not focused, right? I mean, think about
Yes.
football, right? I mean, if one of the tackles isn't doing his job 100%, right? The quarterback's dead. His quarterback is
Yes.
toast, right? So,
Exactly.
like,
Yeah.
golf's a tricky sport because, like, it's so
Or if the
singular,
quarterback has a pass, it's a bad pass, you know?
well, when the
I
quarterback
mean,
doesn't, that's why quarterback
well,
is
he puts
paid
him
so
into the
highly,
danger zone. He knows he's gonna
right?
catch it, but
And that's gonna,
he's gonna break his back.
oh yeah, when he throws one over the middle in the old days when you could just, rip
Exactly.
somebody's head off. But yeah,
Yep.
but golf's a fascinating sport because it's not really a team sport, right? There are times when you do play team, right? But for, Ryder Cup and that kind of thing. But for the
Mhm.
most part, it's a singular sport. And so
See,
that's part of the
it
reason why there's so much crazy camaraderie when they do things like President's Cup or Ryder Cup and they compete as a team because inherently these guys miss that. They're athletes and they do
yes.
miss that team. They miss that team spirit thing. And what I've
Can
noticed,
I
Tristan,
add a
is
component to
yeah,
it?
please.
A component I I would say for the most part an individual sport. But if one were to look at it a little bit differently, you have your sponsors, you have your
Right. Sports
marketing
psychologist,
companies,
like
you have your
trainer.
fans, you have your
Totally.
yeah, you have your trainers, you have your physical
Yeah.
therapist. You do actually have a team, and you do represent them, and you want to make them proud. And even if they're not on those 18 holes with you at the time, they actually are to some extent, because all that you are is the team and your personality and how you interact when you're walking from hole to hole. There are guys that will still say hi or give a signature even hole to hole to a fan or
Well,
something, because it fires them up, it gets them, it boosts their morale.
Well, what's fascinating is guys like Jordan Spieth and Justin Thomas. Some of these guys in their 20s that have, become some of the top players in the world. They
Mm,
use the word "we." They used, "we
I
won,"
love
or right. They're oriented towards
I
exactly what you
love
just shared, the team spirit, right?
I didn't know
Like,
that. Yeah.
oh yeah, I mean, they're
You
way
said
Ricky
Justin
Fowler.
Speed and who else?
Jordan Spieth and Justin
Oh,
Thomas and
Jordan
Ricky
Speed. Yeah, I'm
and
ignorant
Ricky
with
and
names.
Ricky Ricky Fowler, some of these guys that are top 10 or 20 in the world that just came up over the past 4 or 5 years, they
Mm.
came into the world of golf, already competing at the highest level, having had a team, in place for years and years and years, a putting coach, a swing coach, probably a sports psychologist, trainers, parents,
Yes. And when they
agents and
recognize
managers and
it,
so on. Yeah.
they're so
And
much
so,
stronger and more positive.
well, it's just fascinating. What I've seen over decades of following golf is the use of the word we versus I. And some of these younger
Yes.
kids coming up are oriented towards we. And I've always,
Mhm.
that's my, perspective. I'm a we kind of guy. I like, I was telling a kid this morning that I was working with that, I build partnerships with my clients for their personal growth, right?
Mm,
We're in a
mm.
partnership for their growth. And so that's why I don't like it when they're not aware of other, because they're not aware of how powerful that partnership can be.
I love it. And do you find that most CEOs currently that you can see coming on, either private equity managers, fund managers, or Apple execs or whatever, do you find that most of them say I when they're talking to, when they're doing a board, when they're on an earnings call, or when they're in front of, let's say, CNBC or whatever? Do you find that they're using I most of the time? And can you remember anybody who says we all the
You,
time?
off the top of my head, I'm not as oriented that way towards like these young golfers or whatever. But the question is fascinating and I love it. And I can tell you this: I'm hyper aware of the people that say I constantly, right? So I'm
Yes,
aware that that is still, very prevalent. I
exactly.
versus
I can't
we,
remember.
you
I
know,
can't remember we. I
yeah.
actually, I'm
In the
trying to
world
think
of
right now. I
sports, it's
can't think
pretty.
of a single CEO, founder right now off the top of my head that only uses we. Right?
Again, I love the we because it's about partnership and spirit, not about ego. It's not as ego oriented, right? I is so ego oriented, right? Your own
It's
identity, I, right? Versus
yeah.
we. You and I often
Mm-hmm.
talk about this together, right? We use the word we a lot when we describe what
Mm,
it is we do and we create, right? We often
mm,
use that
mm.
word we. It's very rare you and I don't use the word I that as often when we refer to what we're up to, right?
Yes.
And it
There
makes it
there
more
was
fun. It's actually way more fun.
yeah, there was an author, please excuse me for not remembering exactly who it was, but she said that she had written a bestseller, and the fame and the pressure that came from it was so intense that she found it very difficult and got into a depression to write again,
Right.
because you're only as good as your last book, and how can you beat such a
Well, the
bestseller? And it
pressure,
was
yeah,
like,
the pressure became overwhelming.
so what she did was she ended up going on this journey to search for how to overcome it and how to not let it bother her. And she remembered, and I can't remember the author's name, and I'll get it. I'll get it for you for sure. She said that she sat down with her, and she said that what the woman had done, it was a female author, she would, there was this spirit of sorts, and this spirit was constantly moving, and it was almost as though she could visually see it, and it would pass into her, and the the genius came from this spirit, and then she would write on the fly, right? And it would be finished all in one fell swoop. And it wouldn't matter if she was about to fall asleep, or if she was in middle of, uh, could be something as ridiculous as about to get married. She would literally stop everything because she was afraid that it wouldn't come back. And then the spirit would leave. And after that, it was gone. So, what was fascinating about the concept, she started digging into it, was that it's not me, it's not I. There are other elements out there that allow me this process and genius and moment, and it takes the pressure off of self. It takes the
Well,
pressure
yeah.
off of self when it's not only I, and when you've brought in team and you've brought in
Well, in
other,
this case,
and it
yeah, in this case, what you're referring to is often called spirit, right? A lot of writers, especially in the spiritual realms, they feel like they almost channel spirit, what they call spirit or God or source or whatever it is, but
mm,
they're allowing the energy of source or spirit to flow through them, and it's no longer about I or self or whatever. It's happening almost like automatically. And you can get into those
exactly.
zones as an athlete,
Well,
right? As an
but
athlete,
they
you can get
also
there,
they're
right?
not they're not taking credit for it themselves. They're
Right.
just saying that it was a moment that I
Hmm.
had and shared, and it was inspired by something else.
Hmm.
And then writing the next novel, it's like, okay, well, it's not me, and it's either whether I get that inspiration from other things or I don't, and it
Yeah,
is what it is.
and
And
the
you don't beat
challenge is,
yourself up so much about
and the challenge is when you have a lot of success and you're not emotionally prepared for that success, then you can get very much in your head, in your ego, in your
it.
identity,
Yes.
and then you've lost that spirit or whatever that energy is that came through you that allowed you to write the thing in the first place. So, for instance, I worked recently with an 11-year-old athlete that had so much success so young, right? That he
Hmm.
that he literally started to feel the pressure and got in his head and lost his ability to execute because he was the
Mm.
best in the country at what he did at 11 years old and wasn't emotionally prepared for that kind of success.
Right. Right. And the but it's fascinating that we are born as social creatures. We are born as, community oriented creatures. So team, uh other is critical to our own well-being and happiness and our own success. And to, you know believe in the idea that it is I stepping on all others, beating out all others, competing beyond all others. It is I that am greater than other, creates this infection, this virus that actually it's a lie. It's not accurate. Yes, an athlete can be, let's say, Federer. He's a better tennis player than the others. He performs better, but it's not only him. It's his team, and it's his interaction with this team that allows him at his age to still outperform and come back. It
Well,
allows
for
him
sure. I
to
mean,
continue.
in his case, like his relationship with his physio or physical therapist and
Yep.
trainer and massage therapist, that in your late 30s, if you're still playing tennis, top three in the world, that you are relying on your team more and more and more and more and more. But yeah, that's a really good point. Um,
Yeah.
people often aren't oriented this way if they're not necessarily athletes. But one of the things I talk about a lot is helping people build their own team. Like, they're the pitcher, so to speak,
Mhm.
and they build a team of people around them that they honor and take care of in a way that is very profound. Because I often have this, like I often say similar mantras over and over. Often we treat the people we love the worst, and what we really want to do is treat our inner circle the best, right? Because there's only, if we're lucky, there's a handful of people that we can
I've
truly
run
count on.
afoul of that
Yeah,
myself.
yeah. If we're lucky, Tristan, there's probably, four or five people, if we're lucky, that we can truly count on if things get really, really rough, right?
Yes.
And those are the
Yes.
people that we want to like honor the most. And
Yes.
that takes a lot of self-awareness and a lot of self-discipline, right?
Yeah,
To
and I
know,
thought Tiger
yeah.
Woods, um, uh, uh, you know, what's the Augusta,
The Masters at Augusta,
the
the
Masters
Masters.
that he had taken. What was fascinating, and I'd seen, I don't know,
His
maybe
15 major
30
championship.
interviews.
Yeah.
30 interviews after wins and pre tour events. And he's changed a lot in how he talks about his family and his kids and the
He's
support that he gets from those that close internal family. And when he's thanking individuals or he's talking about his win, he's constantly bringing it back to the support that he gets and the positivity he's getting from that internal cluster, that nucleus family. And that's awesome. And I think that is what has allowed him to uh transcend and overcome the challenges that he had, which were many and
Yeah,
far
numerous.
reaching.
Michael
Oh,
Michael Strahan said, the New York Giant defensive end, the most sacks in one season
mm,
by any defensive end. Obviously, he's on, I don't know whether it's Today's Show or what. I don't watch those shows, but
yeah.
he does the football commentary as well. He's world famous. One of the things he talked about is at the end of, he only really enjoyed the last couple of years of his career because he was so caught up in
Interesting.
winning. He was so caught up in the process of winning that he never enjoyed the moment until he got towards the end when he realized it was almost over. And I think Tiger, something similar has happened as he's getting towards the
Mm,
end of his career here. He's had a lot of physical struggles, not just mental and emotional ones.
exactly.
His appreciation now, is so much higher. It's not just all about winning and losing. It's also about enjoying these moments towards the end of his career.
I have
And
a
you could,
question for you.
yeah, and you could notice that distinction to enjoy the
If
process.
if somebody's focused on winning, do you agree that if you're focused on winning, that it's I? So the idea of win is not for the team and everybody else. The idea of win is for that recognition of I at that moment. Or do you think that it's not the case?
It's a fascinating question. I don't have a direct answer for that. I would say my gut says, and
Yeah, I know
I'm
it's
gonna
different.
start asking this question. I'm gonna actually start. I like the question so much. I'm gonna start asking it a lot. But my gut would
Mm.
say that the vast majority of people are oriented towards I, and some people are actually oriented towards we. So in that
Yeah,
moment,
no, no,
they're
no.
not
I
thinking about
mean the idea
themselves.
of win. So
Yeah.
if you have an athlete who's only focused on winning, he is actually only focused on I. And a
Yeah.
guy who's not
Yeah.
focused on winning is focused on the process, present moment, because during that entire 4 hours, whatever, let's say
Yeah.
18 holes, he's interacting with his
Yeah.
caddies, interacting with
Yeah.
his fans. There's a whole slew of other things that
Yeah,
are
I mean,
around
look,
him,
I
his
mean,
environment,
there's,
his team.
look, the guys that tend to be the best in the world at what they do, the Michael Jordans, the Lance Armstrongs, the Tiger Woods, in the prime of their careers, their desire to win is so much greater. Kobe Bryant, their desire to win is so much greater than almost everybody else's on the planet that really they're not nice. You know what I mean? It's not about,
That's
so much
interesting. That's
about, you
fascinating.
know, and then sometimes they change as they get
Same thing
older
with
because
Mike
they
Tyson.
develop. Right. Sometimes they change as they get older. But if you notice Tyson's fights, I've watched a lot of his fights. I grew up in that era. After
Mm,
he knocked somebody out, he would go over to try to see if they're okay. Whereas a lot of people don't have that impulse. And so to me, when I
yes,
watched that,
yes,
Tyson
that's
actually
true.
cared about other people. Whereas you see some
Yeah,
fighters knock somebody out and all they're doing is bragging about how great they are. And they don't give
right.
a flying you know what about whether someone lived or died. Tyson would run over and try to hug the person or pick them up or make sure that they were okay. Even in his heyday when he was, doing a lot of drugs and alcohol and it was, was all messed up, he still cared about other people. You could tell that he's actually
Yes,
was fundamentally decent on some level. Whereas other people,
I
knock people out and they could die. I mean, literally, they could die. Boxers die. MMA people,
yeah,
people die and they don't care. Like, they just want to,
I
all
know.
they care about is winning, right?
Here's
Or, yeah.
I have to retract what I said about Tyson. Here's why. And it makes me think it's deeper. He actually did all that he did and was so successful because of his mentor. What was his name? Cus Diamato, right?
Hmm.
Which was his coach and mentor his entire life, and uh, and that every time he went out, he even says it. He went out for him, and he was uh, championing for him. He was winning for him. He never went in there and said it's because I am doing this, so I get the recognition. He actually just every time that he did a round, he would turn around, you know, and he would try to get a reaction right from his mentor, and he would try to see like, hey, was that good? Was that bad? It was constantly this teamwork that allowed him, I think, to reign supreme for so long. And I'm very curious if these guys who are only focused on self, if yes, they become the best, but for a short amount of time. And the guys that last the longest, the longevity, are the guys that are not self-oriented. It and they do become the best, but they're more consistent over a longer period of time.
Yeah, I don't have a direct answer to that, but I do have, a perspective that it seems that as athletes age and as they develop more perspective and they're aware of their mortality, so to speak, in their sport, the time limited nature of how much time they have less, they sometimes have, they get more decent, so to speak. It's not all about just winning and losing and being so hyper aggressive and hyper focused on winning
That's
and at
interesting.
all costs. You know what I mean? Because
Do you think
like
that
because
you could create that as a young age if a kid were, let's say this 11-year-old, he's able to get the right mentorship? Do
you
you
know
think that he
sometimes the
can he can
fire
not
though
run into
some
that?
look, I mean, some people are more oriented personality wise towards team, and some people are more oriented towards self. And that can be somewhat characterological, right? It's already developed. Some people are more narcissistic. That's a personality style, right? They're
Yeah, yeah,
characterologically, some people are more self-driven, self-focused, self-absorbed.
right. But
Can you
what we're
learn to
trying
be
to
more oriented
target
towards,
are the
yeah.
champions, like the number one, the best in their field.
Like I would say it depends. You're not changing a Tiger Woods in his heyday. In his heyday, he won because he had to be better. Michael Jordan, they had to be better than everybody else. They're complete outliers in their drive and their perseverance and their, competitive spirit in order to win at all costs, right? That's not going to, you don't want to change that in their heyday. But over time,
So
they have to make a
now I have
transition. Yeah.
a devil's advocate question. So if you are mentoring individuals to be more team oriented, to use the word we, etc., do you think that it has the chance of hampering the outlier, champion that, well, I mean, how many weeks in a row was it that Tiger Woods, he was like 600 and change,
That's
600
crazy.
whatever weeks in a row
Yeah.
that he was number one in the world? Do you think that it can potentially hamper somebody that is a number one champion?
I definitely think it can hamper them, but I also, what I'm trying to communicate and share is that, over time, we need to change, right? Because, if we
Yes.
don't evolve and we don't like bend and become more flexible
But
and
I mean
adapt,
prior to
you
that level, like
no,
if
I
you're training a
understand. Like
16-year-old.
look, I mean, it depends how they're oriented, right? My bias is toward team spirit, right? And team and not self. But there's some kids that like there's a limit to what you can do. Their fire is coming from their desire to win at all costs. And if that's where
I
their
love
fire
it.
is coming from, I'm not
So
gonna mess with it, so to speak. nor
And
would
I
they,
love it.
nor would they, I would get fired anyway, even if I tried to, right? Meaning like,
Well, well,
you're unlikely to sort
well,
of like, you don't, if you caused someone to get worse, right? That's the tricky
mm,
part. If they got worse when they started working with you, not better, if they start winning less, how long are you going to stay on board anyway, right?
true.
For a longer
So what
term
you're
outcome that's
communicating,
better, it's tricky. This is very tricky stuff, right?
I love it. So what you're communicating is that if it's their essence, their true essence, you're not going to mess with it because you're just going to hone in on it and make it better. So you're not going to rewire someone's nature if it is it's advantageous in their career or where they are, and so you're aware of that completely, and you work with what is natural to them. You're not trying to make everyone like you, and you're not trying to make everyone like your personal ideology. You're simply trying to make them better in their own essence.
Exactly, but also,
Am I
yeah, yeah,
phrasing that
exactly.
right?
Yeah, yeah, he phrases it perfectly well, but I might also make them aware of, issues that might arise in the future, not so much so they can make changes in the present, but so they're more aware of the need to adapt down the road, so that it's almost like
Right.
planting a seed, right? You're planting a
Signal
seed.
planting. There's
Yeah,
something in
you're
psychology.
planting a seed that this might work perfectly, for your 20s, but at some point
Mm,
down the road, you might need to make some adaptive changes here because what works in your 20s might not work in your 30s, right? And I
I
think
love that. So
tigers
signal
evolved.
posting to the
Yeah.
individuals that are they're not ready for it, number one, or number two, it's not the right time, but at least you've put the seeds there. So this way, over time, they're reflecting on it more and more. And by the time it comes the pre-stage of entering into that transition, they're already prepped and ready, and it's not so jarring and alien to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, that's another part of psychology and coaching and mentoring is
Mm,
recognizing what is, what's worthwhile to work on and what isn't. I think physical swing coaches are doing something similar, right? There are golfers like
mm,
Jim Furyk. There's another young golfer that just came up
good
with
point.
super unique swings that are just homegrown. They're not the best designed swing, but they work perfectly
Mm,
for that golfer. You don't want to mess with something that's natural, right? So
right.
you want to, but you want to point out that it is possible down the road that some changes might need to occur. In Furyk's
So
case,
the
it's not the
best,
case. His swing is going to
so
hold
one of,
up for his lifetime, and it's a unique
so
swing, right?
so one
Yeah.
of the best criterion you would agree would be a mentor that is has an uncanny knack for timing, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Because
look, the
knowing
best,
the timing of these things is critical. It's
totally, but
not just the techniques. It's actually there's something else that the doctor must have the ability for.
well, it's not just the doctor, the mentor, the guide, the coach, because think about
Yes,
it.
that's what I
Coaches
meant
that are
to
super,
that's what I meant
right?
to say.
Yeah, because the coaches that are really, the best, in my opinion, are really flexible. They know when you step on somebody, when you give them love and support, when you give them encouragement, when you're tough, when you gotta
Mm,
like literally, kick them out, so to speak. So that sort of
right.
flexibility, the old Giants coach Tom Coughlin went through a difficult time because he was too rigid. And then he actually, in his 60s, changed, which is rare, right? The old dog
Amazing.
actually became more flexible, not crazy flexible, but more flexible. And then he had more success and won another Super Bowl after making changes to his coaching
Wow.
style, which is pretty rare. So
That's
some of
amazing.
the most talented like coaches, they're really like aware of their need to be hyper flexible and adaptive to not just like different players and different players' personalities, but the different aspects of what you refer to as timing in the player's
Mm,
development, right?
mm.
And so
And
this
that's what
is,
is the key to success.
and I think it's also
It's
the
actually
key
it
to,
reminds me of trading,
right.
or invest the key to know when to enter and when to exit. A lot of it is, yes, you can have all the analysis under the sun. Yes, you can have all the metrics you want and the trend riding with you. But unless you know your entry and exit, it doesn't matter if you're right. It's when you're right. If you're right 3 years early, but you lost money, it doesn't work.
Yeah, so
So,
timing of interventions in psychology is very, is really important, right? So,
mhm,
knowing when, because there are times when I step on a kid, right? It's like when I step on them in
yep,
a decent way, but I get pretty
mm,
assertive and, maybe even a little bit aggressive because they need to learn something they're not learning, right? But
right, right,
I might wait months and months and months and months for the right timing, right? In
hmm,
order for
hmm,
me to bring something up in you know what I mean, that they are now ready to hear, so to speak, right?
right.
So that's
What,
intuition and experience, right? No, having
exact,
done
and also,
decades,
yeah, experience.
right,
Just about to
right,
say,
yeah.
and not just that, but also a unique trait of the coach or the doctor that is entirely focused on other for those moments and not
So
biased to self, right?
that's
Because otherwise, if you put your timing in there and it's your timing, it's not their timing. So the
exactly.
best
So
doctors are the ones that don't look at you as a number or look at you as a paycheck. They're just looking at you as a human being that has unique thoughts, unique ideologies, unique, physicality, etc., and is paying attention to all facets of it, taking notes during that session or whatever it is. That's a critical element of being able to choose the right coach or choose the right doctor, mentor, be it psychologist or whatever. I mean, I think that's a uh, extremely extremely important point that you naturally have because of your perspective of team, we, and others. Since I don't know if you're born that way, or if it's
being a
because of
because of
a
being an
twin
identical twin,
relationship,
yeah, I'm an
or
identical twin. But also, like the essence of what we're talking about is, being aware. One of the things I'm aware of when I get involved in coaching and guiding and mentoring, right, is that I'm
mm,
taking someone on a journey. It's a personal growth journey. And so
mm,
I'm aware that, like, on my
for
end,
both of
I,
you, yeah,
yes, I'm taking us on a journey, right? And I'm aware that
mm,
on my end, I need to be very, very patient on my end of the journey, right? To
mm,
be aware that, patience is really important, that I can't force someone to change. There's no such thing. It doesn't work, right? You're
exactly.
inviting
So
people to change over time in creative ways. Literally, it's creative.
yes. So bringing it back full circle to the kid with the relationship, he moved in with this woman. Do you find that the both of their so both people's timing, their understanding of each other's timing has to be understood by each other, and if their timing is miscalibrated, then there's nothing you can do to align them correctly. So do you find that they both have different times of when they need certain things to happen, and they're just not aligned, they're not in
Well,
line with each other?
one of the things I've said to this woman, because I've been guiding her on and off for years, is I said, because she's an intense personality, and I said to her, you're probably going to need a more emotionally sophisticated guy. Even before he moved in with her, I told her
Mm,
that she's most likely going to need somebody with patience and poise and perseverance and perspective, right? Which tends to
mm,
be a guy that's not age 30, right? It tends to
Mm,
be a
mm.
guy that's lived more, that has more perspective and more patience and poise. And so it's not working out. It's not a surprise to me because he's still a kid emotionally. As a male, we
Mm.
both know that age 30 is still relatively young. It takes a long time to grow up emotionally and to develop
Yes,
such a
unless
thing.
unless they
Yes,
were an outlier. Exactly.
unless they're an outlier. In general, age 30 is still relatively young around issues like patience and poise and perspective.
Absolutely.
People that have had
Yeah.
more experience, a lot more experience, can get there sooner. But
Yep.
but there is something about
Few and
having
far
lived.
between.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, I feel like this has been a fabulous discussion. I want to continue it. I feel like we're going to get interrupted soon, so I want to sign off. I'm welcome to Open
Sounds
Door
good.
with Dr. Brett. I'm Dr. Brett, and this is Tristan, and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks. All right. Catch up soon.
All right, see you, pal.
Ciao.